Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Think BRICS YouTube channel. Right now, we are living through a time of historical transformation, and few scholars have charted its course as clearly as my guest today. I want to welcome back again Radhika Desai back to the channel. For those who are first time watchers, Radhika is a professor at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba, Winnipeg, Canada, as well as a visiting professor in the Department of International Development at the London School of Economics and Political Science. In addition, she's also the director of Geopolitical Economy Research Group, as well as the convener of the International Manifesto Group, as well as being the author of a lot of fascinating titles, but ones in particular that I want to highlight are Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, a Geopolitical Economy, as well as Geopolitical Economy after U.S. Hegemony. Lastly, Slouching Towards Iowa, From Congress to Hinduva in Indian Politics. Radhika, your work honestly helps provide essential context for the developments in this multipolar world, and I'm really thrilled that you were able to join us today.
What a nice welcome, Ben. Thank you very much. You are being very flattering, but great to be
Oh,
here as well. Yeah.
no, it's of course, no, we always want your insights, and that's why we're so thrilled to have you back. And I want to first ask you about sort of BRICS in of itself and how it can kind of transform a little bit more towards what we'll call like a true multipolar system. And you've recently emphasized that the strength of the BRICS alliance depends on the members' commitment to, as you've said, a firm opposition or heavy modification of neoliberalism. And you've noted that countries like Brazil and South Africa may be capable of following this set of policies sufficiently strongly. But since you've also quoted on India trying to move towards Russia and China, quote, kicking and screaming, what transformations do you think must take place so BRICS reflects as a force against imperialism rather as simply an alliance that focuses on like trade and development?
I want to give a three-part answer. The first part is just a small clarification. I believe that today China, of course, is following more or less the path that you need to follow. Russia is being forced to do the same by the circumstances of the Ukraine conflict, which has been ongoing for a very long time, although obviously to a lesser extent. But of the BRICS, India, Brazil, as well as South Africa, are actually less able to follow this path. So that's the first clarification.
Right.
The second clarification I would like to make is that essentially, you asked me about what sort of policies, what sort of changes would need to take place before they acquired the before they implemented the sort of policies that I think would really reinforce their productive power, would reinforce BRICS, and so on. And to me, those policies, are generally described by the concerned scholars as involving a developmental state. So, a developmental state that is capable of pursuing industrial policies and creating a more efficient and competitive industrial sector, etc. And of course, particularly because all the countries that we're talking about are fairly large. I mean, India, of course, is the biggest country in the world now in terms of population, but also Brazil and South Africa are not small countries, nor are Russia and China. So we're talking about large countries, and it is possible for these large countries to pursue a path of development that is mainly focused on developing and deepening and broadening the domestic market rather than following export oriented policies. I mean, I'm not saying that there should be no trade. Of course, there should be trade, but the purpose of trade should not be the main stimulus of growth. The main stimulus of growth should come from the domestic market, which means, or the direct implication of that is that they must also follow relatively egalitarian policies which put more money into the pockets of ordinary people and families and so on, so that their demand drives the economy forward. So and naturally trade and international investment can play a role in enhancing these aspects, in creating interesting mutual collaborations and so on. But the very moment you list these requirements, you realize that actually any old government is not going to undertake them. I mean, the reason why the countries that I'm talking about, Brazil, South Africa, India, are not pursuing these policies is not because, they don't know better. It's because the governments there primarily serve the interests of the ruling classes, of the corporate capitalist classes, the biggest corporations, not even necessarily the whole capitalist class, but the biggest corporations. And I think that to change this now would require a very fundamental political transformation. I mean, basically, what I'm saying is that in order to pursue such policies, you need governments in power that who make the welfare of ordinary people in the country their main purpose. And I think that that's going to take a lot. In recently, for example, in the last year in the Indian elections, we there was a fairly decent coalition opposing the Narendra Modi's BJP. And they, in fact, managed to reduce his majority, or that is to say, to eliminate his majority. The Modi government no longer has a majority, and that was good. But since then, the momentum behind such developments has dissipated, unfortunately.
Yeah, and you make, and kind of relating back to sort of India's positioning here, we see that it actually has a very special relationship with the United States. I mean, the United States is India's biggest export market, and they've, long been in agreement on like defense cooperation, things like that. But one thing that you've argued about India and the United States relationship in particular is that these increasing pressure by the United States, like impositions of like tariffs or secondary sanctions, might actually compel India to shift away from their long-standing strategy of Nehruvian development, right? Which relates back to this export growth strategy. So, for could you elaborate on what the core principles are for Nehruvian development, and if you think in the long term if this is their best strategy here?
So yeah, so first of all, let me say that India. Okay. What is Nehruvian development? So basically, when India became independent, it was the first prime minister was Jawaharlal Nehru, and he had at least a certain type of socialistic bent of mind, and he appointed some very astonishing intellectuals to things like the Planning Commission and so on. And beginning with the second 5 year plan, so from the mid 50s onwards, um, there was a vision expressed in this, in which essentially what would happen is that you would undertake land reform in India. That is to say, essentially, get rid of landlordism and allow peasants to cultivate their own land, which would entirely change the incentive structure. If you're a peasant and you know that no matter how hard you work, a very large part of what you are going to produce is going to be taken away by the landlord, whether in cash or kind, then your motivation for increasing production and investing in your land, etc., is relatively low. But if you know that you and your family are going to enjoy all the fruits of your labor, then your ability to produce and your desire to and your enthusiasm to produce will be much greater. So, land reform was supposed to change the incentive structure in Indian agriculture and make it much more productive and also, therefore, capable of uh, of providing all the various things that industrialization needs. If you think about it, if you're moving from a primarily agricultural economy to an industrialized economy, and you have no outside resources to speak of, nobody else is going to help you industrialize, then a whole lot of things have to come from agriculture to go into industry. So, first of all, investable surpluses have to come from there. Agriculture has to start producing much more food because as you industrialize, you will be creating an industrial working class which is no longer producing its own food. So that means that those who are remain remaining in agriculture will have to produce more food. They will also have to produce raw materials. They will also, of course, have to give up a lot of labor, because if you need labor for industry, where are they going to come from? So there's a very profound relationship between industry and agriculture in the process of industrialization. So people thought that having made land reform, this would, for a goodly time, provide the resources to industrialize, and the state was going to play a very important role in uh, 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 making the big investments that would be necessary to create the fundamental basic industry, the core industries that you need for industrialization. So this was the sort of plan, but the problem that emerged is that the Congress Party, as a political instrument, did not have the political capacity um, to enact land reform beyond a limited land reform. It was not successful in creating land reform, and so from the beginning, India's industrialization has been hobbled as a result of that. But a Nehruvian form of development would have been that you have a prosperous agriculture based on a prosperous peasant agriculture, which is then capable of, capable of sustaining industrialization. In industrialization, you have a lot of state ownership, and gradually you are able to develop by expanding the domestic market. Initially, a prosperous peasantry, and eventually well paid working people, and so on, who then constitute the market, whose demand becomes the stimulus for industrial investment.
Yeah, and you make a very good point about how, like you said, if we're working from the domestic market outwards, you both have to look both within your own national economic model, but also within, not just how to reform your own national economic model, but also sort of the international institutions that could be useful in areas like loans and investment and everything like that. But I want to focus first on the national, and then we can go to the international institutions. You've argued that China, because of the combination of their planned economy system, but also the lack of speculation in their own financial system, has made their economy much more stable, and it has allowed sort of a beacon of development to lead the world really in the technological capacities that we're seeing as the world evolves more. Can you explain why the combination of this planned economy and this lack of speculation is fundamentally contrasting what we're seeing with Western economic systems? And perhaps, like, how can emerging nations learn from the models that we see both within BRICS, but also the mistakes that the Western economies have made up to this point?
Yeah, so I would say that there are two. There are many aspects to answer your question. So let me begin first with the issue of the financial system. So that you can have two very different types of financial systems. So all financial systems are not the same. China, and to some extent also India in the early period, in the Nehruvian period, but China, also countries like South Korea in their development, or Germany when it was developing, Japan when it was, during its miracle growth period, they all had financial systems which were essentially geared towards lending for long term industrial investment. One phrase that is bandied about these days is patient capital. You need patient capital. You can't have a financial system in which investment is short term, flighty, here today, gone tomorrow, etc. So you need big banks that are capable of lending for a long-term projects that will eventually become very profitable, but you have to wait for a long time. Whereas in the West, we have financial systems that are, first of all, as far as the banking sector is concerned, hardly any of the banking sector lends for long-term industrial investment. A lot of the lending of these Western financial institutions is to, for speculative purposes, to, amongst themselves, and so on, or it is for consumer purposes. So they're lending you to buy a car or buy a house or what have you, but they're not lending primarily for industrial investment. And insofar as they do lend to big corporations, these corporations are often using this money for things like share buybacks. So the credit serves to inflate asset bubbles, because when companies buy their shares back, it inflates the value of the shares because there is more demand in the market for those shares, and that's why they are buying them. Because these days, the worth of any corporate executive is judged by what is the share value. And of course, and in recent times, of course, central banks in western countries have also supported asset price inflation, the speculative asset price inflation, by pursuing easy money policies. So these are two totally different types of financial systems. And the second thing I would add is that, we often talk about the golden age of growth, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And since the onset of neoliberalism, we have seen, we were supposed to, neoliberalism was supposed to restore the productive dynamism of capitalism, but we have not seen that. What we've seen is a syndrome of low growth, low investment, and financialization. And of course, alongside financialization, we've had skyrocketing inequality, and financialization is directly tied up with that. But in the golden age of growth, basically every government had capital controls, that is to say, controls on large amounts of money going in and out of the country. And I would say, and China still has capital controls. By the way, India also still has capital controls, although in both cases they have been liberalized to some extent, but there is no completely free movement of money into and out of the country. And India, anyway, I would say, capital controls are absolutely necessary, because if you don't have capital controls, first of all, the rich people of your country will increasingly be investing in the speculative and predatory financial system, which is the dollar-based financial system. And rather than engaging in productive investment, they will be taking their profits and putting them there, which is partly what is happening in countries like India, South Africa, Brazil, etc. So the elites of these countries are very invested in that type of predatory and speculative investment. And and so the last point I would make is that, people often talk about this so-called trilemma of, that you can have a or, independent monetary policy, stable exchange rates, and free capital flows. They say you can only have two of these three things at any one time. And my answer is that it's a complete no brainer. It is not a trilemma at all, because you don't need free capital flows. Because a system of capital controls does not mean that capital will not go in and out. It only means that only that capital will go in and out which is permitted by the central bank, and the central bank should be committed to, essentially making sure that only productive capital is allowed in. That once it's allowed in, it's invested, and it's not sort of, constantly taking profits out, and so on. So and it becomes committed to your economy, and so on. And of course, it also prevents the rich people from essentially squirreling away their money and putting them into into this giant tax haven, which is the dollar denominated Western financial system.
Yeah, and one thing that that's sort of with that is in relation to a lot of the problems within a lot of these Western economic systems, in particular with the United States, is like you were talking about with the asset bubble speculation, and you highlighted a lot of the issues and things in the what they call the fire sector, right? The finance and the insurance and real estate sectors that are prone to this kind of speculation. But I actually want to throw one more piece in there to actually kind of get a full view of the United States economy, and it's sort of the military industrial complex, because I think that kind of makes a bigger picture about all of this. Can you explain a little bit about how the military industrial complex fits into the overall economic puzzle and also enables the United States to be this imperial, I guess this imperial hegemon?
Okay, so first of all, let me say that let's begin with the US economy. So, the first thing is that the US economy over the past 40 odd years more, maybe since the late 70s anyway, so almost 50 years. It has basically been on this neoliberal path. And the neoliberal path has always involved deregulation and so on. And the one area, so, and deregulation was supposed to free capital to do whatever it likes. But I would argue that in the United States, this deregulation has only led to financialization. That is to say, the diversion of more and more profits and more money away from productive investment and towards financial speculation and towards predatory lending. So those are the two things that financialization does. And so you have seen an expansion of the so-called FIRE sector. FIRE stands for finance, insurance, and real estate. And of course, this has also been the source of a series of financial crises, both within the United States and in those economies whom the US persuaded to lift capital controls. So you have had, the neoliberal era has been punctuated by by a series of financial crises, some of them very big. Now, over these decades, during which the United States has been financializing, the US industrial structure has changed in such a way that it now there is a limited number of industries in which the United States has any kind of, shall we say, dominance. And that dominance is largely through American power rather than anything else. And those industries are the fire sector, which is, of course, directly connected with the power of the dollar over the world. Secondly, there is, of course, the military industrial complex, and the military industrial complex, of course, it survives on essentially extremely lucrative cost plus contracts from the US government. And of course, as you know, through NATO, due to what's called interoperability requirements, other governments
Yeah.
also place orders with American defense producers. And then there are a couple of others. There is, of course, the ICT sector, in which, again, and the pharmaceutical sector, where, again, because of intellectual property rights, which the US requires everybody to observe. Of course, people don't have to observe them, but countries don't have to observe them. China doesn't necessarily observe them always, but countries whose arms can be twisted, they will have their arms twisted to respect US intellectual property rights and so on. So these are the sectors in which the US is doing well. But now, of course, what you are looking at is that apart from the fire sector, in which, as I say, too many people remain, too many elites of the around the world remain too committed to it. You're seeing problems everywhere. Take for example the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex is today a $1 trillion affair, right? The government, U.S. government spends trillion dollars a year on the military, but despite all this spending, the military-industrial complex is now technologically behind the Russians, the Chinese, and so on. So the Russians and the Chinese, and even the Turks and the Iranians, are producing weaponry which is more effective, and you're seeing the effects of this in Ukraine. So, whereas the U.S. military industrial complex, they are not producing these sorts of drones, they are not producing hypersonic missiles, and what have you. So, in a certain sense, you can say that these, like you're beginning to see trouble even in these core sectors on which the US depends.
Yeah, a lot with this kind of the promoting of these neoliberal policies, if they aren't really able to do it sort of in a bilateral way in means of coercion, we honestly are seeing it that much more evidently in a lot of the international institutions that that we're going to circle back to. And I think like a lot of what we're seeing right now, we see it in like three main areas: the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, the WTO, to varying degrees. And you can argue that they really have all promoted neoliberal policies. Like, you put it on a spectrum, but but you in particular have noted that a there's a level of control that the United States has with the IMF and the World Bank that they don't necessarily have with the World Trade Organization. And so, could you explain why that's the case, and how the United States has been able to sort of favor these neoliberal policies that these institutions are favoring?
So the reason why the United States has a veto essentially in the World Bank and the IMF is that I think they have, the voting power is based on the your GDP essentially. So so uh, uh, countries representing 17% of the world GDP provide so US has essentially the US has a veto because it represents more than 17% of the world economy, and therefore it has voting shares in the IMF and the World Bank, which always allow it to veto anything that they don't want. That is the reason for the disproportionate power of the United States. And the IMF and the World Bank weren't particularly important until the third world debt crisis of the early 1980s, at which point these organizations, which were not up to that point very important, were essentially given a new remit, which was to act as bailiffs for Western financial institutions that were now in trouble because they had lent to all these third world countries who were now unable to pay. And the IMF and the World Bank performed their job very well. They ensured that bulk of the money would be repaid on extremely onerous terms. They contributed also a great, and of course in the process they did two other things. The number one, they imposed neoliberal policies on all the countries that were in debt difficulties, essentially by imposing structural adjustment programs. So they said, if you want emergency funding from us, then you must reform your economies in a neoliberal fashion. You must cut social spending. You must cut state spending, reduce taxes, blah blah, etc. Whatever. So all of these. So that was the first thing, and the second thing, of course, was that the IMF and the World Bank basically promoted a sort of amnesia about a very important thing about debt, is that when a debt cannot be paid, both the creditor and the debtor are generally considered responsible, because the creditor is also responsible. Why did he or she lend the money if there was going to be trouble? They should have examined this carefully. But the IMF and the World Bank essentially made the world forget the idea of creditor responsibility, and debt became primarily the debtor's responsibility. So they they loaded the dice in favor of creditors. So that's the IMF and the World Bank. But very interestingly, I should say that today the role of the IMF and the World Bank, in the new century, after the 1997-98 East Asian financial crisis, when the whole world could see what the way in which the IMF dealt with South Korea, which was, by that time, one of the, economic miracle economies and so on. But the way in which they dealt with South Korea was like, as though it were just any, well, they imposed all sorts of conditionalities on South Korea. And so when people saw that, which was very harmful to South Korea's industrial structure, when people saw that, um, uh, uh, you know, uh, uh, people kind of realized, governments around the world realized the dangers of dealing with the IMF and the World Bank. Plus, beginning in the new century, because after the dot-com bubble burst, the Federal Reserve started pursuing an easy money policy. And when they started pursuing an easy money policy, uh, money in search of returns, essentially financial institutions and all sorts of people in search of returns were willing once again to lend to third world countries directly, by essentially encouraging them to float bonds and so on. So essentially, the IMF and the World Bank's loan portfolio shrank during these years. It expanded slightly again after 2008, but on the whole, they are no longer as important as they once were. Also, China has entered the world as a major creditor in the world market, so that countries that want to borrow money have also this option available. The WTO is different. The WTO was advertised when I very vividly remember when it was launched in 1995. And at that time, the idea was that it was going to create a single sort of, practically legally enforcing free trade over the world and so on. But that was the rhetoric. In reality, the WTO remained much closer to what the GATT had been. And what the GATT, which is the organization that it replaced, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT was basically a place where people would gather to come to mutually agreed reductions of tariffs and so on. So countries would join, they would agree to reduce tariffs and so on. And so it was only what could be agreed. It's a bit like what's going on at COP 30 right now, in Belém. So because of that, the US, and what happened as well is that the US initially encouraged China to join the WTO. Now in the WTO, if you claim developing country status, then you are not required, even the few rules there are about pursuing free trade and so on. If you're a developing country, you don't have to observe those rules in quite the same way. And so China has enjoyed that protection. And I think that in a certain sense, and of course China has been pursuing very good industrial policies and developmental policies and so on. So the WTO has became a platform through which China really expanded its trade footprint around the world. um, and of course the United States in the process of deindustrialization has fared rather badly from the WTO as well as from the various trade agreements that it has made. So you have seen a process of deindustrialization in the United States. Now this deindustrialization is not something that the elites were trying to stop, or the elites are not complaining about it. They have been the agents of deindustrialization. The corporate elites are the ones who have made the decisions to outsource production to other countries and so on and so forth. So it's not they who care. But the reason why Trump has become so, irate about the WTO and various trade agreements and so on, is because today deindustrialization has led to a situation in the United States where ordinary people are hurting. And and as I've said many times, Trump figured out one thing, that you can no longer win elections by telling Americans that their economy is doing very well. So he told them that, he said, it's not doing well and we need to do something about it. The difficulty is that instead of blaming neoliberal policies, instead of blaming financialization, etc., he has blamed trade and immigrants for the difficulties they have, instead of blaming the corporate elite in whose favor neoliberalism functions. Because at the end of the day, the one thing that Trump shares with the Bidens and the Harrises of this world is that he wishes to reinforce the power of the same corporate elite. So, anyway, to cut a long story short, the WTO has been a much more difficult thing for the United States to deal with, and it has often what's the word for it? It has often disregarded WTO rulings. Yeah. So there you have it. Oh, and one final point. Uh,
Yes.
China has just announced, just about a month ago, I think China announced that it will no longer be claiming developing country status within the WTO. Now, this is a very significant development, and I think that China is positioning itself to expand, to stabilize the WTO and expand its influence as a forum where countries can negotiate mutually acceptable trade agreements.
Like you were saying about, while the United States does not have, while China's basically able to step up in the WTO to provide a lot of stabilization, I think a lot of people are arguing that the credibility that the IMF and the World Bank has lost up to this point has allowed countries to pivot towards the new development bank that the BRICS bloc established, as well as like the contingent reserve arrangement that was supposed to offer these alternatives. But one thing that you've highlighted and that we've talked a lot about is the importance of capital controls. And the fact that the new development bank isn't really incentivizing members to impose capital controls, nor really supporting those that are doing so, is something that is an interesting development. I guess, like, my final question to you is, do you think the new development bank is losing an opportunity here to operate sort of as this more of a conventional development bank rather than encouraging countries to have these capital controls and regulations necessary so they don't fall into the same mistakes that Western economies had?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that actually both the CRA and the New Development Bank, the NDB, I would say that, your question is perhaps giving them more importance than they deserve. I think that while they have been created, they, in any case, they rely very importantly for many important, in many important ways, they are reliant on the broader structures created by the IMF and the World Bank and so on. So they're really not as important. I think in the financial scene today, if you're thinking about multipolarity and what are the institutions that are encouraging multipolarity, I would say that the financial institutions of China itself, like Chinese banks, the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, sorry, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, various Chinese banks, I think their lending is transforming the international sort of economic and investment relations and so on much more fundamentally than the New Development Bank or the CRA. So I doubt that they are going to be the agents promoting capital controls or anything like that. I think that really this kind of I think discussions about these things would be. There's not even very much discussion about these things. Some countries have capital controls, others don't have capital controls, and this is not about to change in any significant way immediately. But I think that any financial arrangement that would create a sort of world money rather than these kind of bilateral arrangements that we have seen, or very limited arrangements that we are seeing now. If you're going to go to that, to a arrangement that involves many countries, many systemically important countries, then I think that Keynes's proposals for a central bank currency would be the way to go, and that would require some kind of capital controls.
Right. Yeah, that's all very, honestly, very interesting. And we'll see how sort of the model develops too, because honestly, in in this world right now, there's a new story every day and tides are shifting constantly. But I do want to conclude the interview. But first, I want to give my thanks to Radhika Desai for joining us today. It was an absolute masterclass at looking beyond the headlines to the deeper currents that are shaping our multipolar world today. So be sure to like and hype this video up and subscribe to our YouTube channel as well as our social media pages if you want to discover more insightful content like this, as well as to be sure to follow Radhika on her social media such as her X, LinkedIn, and her YouTube page that she'll officially be posting very soon, so you can stay updated on her work as it develops. Thank you so much, Radhika, for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Ben. Great talking to you as always.